Thank you, Brad. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today and to facilitate such a fantastic panel. I'm sure it'll be a very interesting discussion. We'll look particularly at how the public sector will be impacted by technologies such as AI, machine learning and augmented reality. It's my pleasure to be here today with Kerryn Weinkamp, Martin Hehir and Caroline Trotman. Hello. And before I throw to the floor for questions, I'd just like to start by asking each of you to just present a quick 2-minute statement outlining your thoughts on today's topic. Caroline, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Thanks, Katie, and thank you for inviting me here today. I think this is just a fascinating topic, and there's so much scaremongering about what jobs are going to be left for humans in this new world that we're coming into. But I'd like to start with a very positive premise. Sorry, I'm speaking to the microphone here. I think we should never underestimate the willingness of employees to acquire new skills. Think about the skills that we no longer see in workplaces as a result of the internet. You know, we don't have filing clerks anymore. We don't have stationery officers. We don't have anyone running a mailroom. Not exactly the jobs that people were aspiring to spend their lives doing. There's some very interesting research that's being done now around just what do employees think about this new world of the fourth industrial revolution, what it's going to do to their work lives. And the overwhelming majority see it as a great opportunity. They don't see it as something that's terribly frightening and scary and means the end of work for humans. So I think underlying this scenario that we're coming into, there are a series of very positive outcomes that we can take from it. People want to develop new skills and they're impatient to thrive in intelligent enterprises that can improve their working experience. And I think that's what I'd love to see us explore today.
Thanks, Caroline. Martin, did you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, and good morning. And again, thank you for having me here today. So, from our perspective, looking more broadly, our department is thinking about the future of work and its implications for our goal of getting people into jobs, and so they can support themselves now and into the future. But in thinking about that, we have to think about ourselves, and we know that we have to adapt, that we have to be innovative, and that we have to do business in a way that we haven't done to date. But I'd also like to echo the comments that we've just heard, which is we see a really positive future. We see good growth in skilled jobs. We see good growth in jobs across the economy at the moment, but certainly we see good growth in skilled jobs. And we do see a lot of dull and boring jobs being overtaken by machines, allowing people to connect. And it's certainly that piece of work that we're most focused on, which is the human skills, or the broad, what we call now employability skills, and their dominance, and the need for them to be brought out both within our own staff, but within the broader community.
Thank you. Kerryn.
Thank you, everybody. It's been really interesting listening to the presentation so far this morning, and it's nice to be on a very positive panel because the Commission is certainly looking at the future of work and the impact on the Australian public service, and we've been doing this now for quite some time, but obviously the focus is ramping up quite a lot. We have a workforce of just over 150,000, so we are wrangling just the same as many other private sector companies with how we actually address some of this. And as Martin said, we're actually quite excited because we think that a lot of the jobs that will become available will be very interesting. And it is very important for us as we go forward, though, that we communicate that to all of our staff across the service, and that we have very positive conversations around what the future looks like, because I think that is our biggest risk. When you consider that the workforce is based primarily outside of Canberra and we have a big international workforce as well, we have a big footprint to be able to ensure that everybody is really clear about what the future might look like, what the changes are, how we're going to employ people, how we will actually work in the future. We heard a lot from DHS about the future of work and some of the amazing things that they're doing with their staff. And we need to actually ensure that that operates across the service. So when people come into one organisation, they can actually see that they will have a future across the broader Australian public service and how they can operate in a flexible way.
Great, thank you so much. We might just open to the room now for some questions. We do have a roving mic. If you do have a question, please stand up and mention your name and the organisation that you're from. Okay, well, I might pose a question to the panel in that case. We've heard a lot this morning about tasks versus jobs, the injection of people skills. Martin, you just mentioned that yourself. And Kerryn, you talked about the importance of communicating a positive message across the public service. What other steps is the Australian Public Service Commission taking to manage transition and career development?
Look, we, aside from doing lots of talking about it and getting out and trying to engage with staff around it, we're also looking at how we're managing talent. So it was really interesting watching the Telstra presentation just then. We're actually getting older, like everybody else. We've got quite a big risk with our senior executive service. We've got something like 75% of the senior executive service will reach an age where they can retire in the next 10 years. So we've got quite a bit of work to do to ensure that we've got people coming through that can take up those roles. So we're doing a lot of work in the identification of talent and really trying to learn from the private sector about how they tap talent early and how they manage people's careers through. So really encouraging people not only to take control of their own careers, but also identifying those that we might want to spend a bit more time and focus on bringing through.
And Martin, given that you mentioned that before, as Deputy Secretary within Department of Employment, what are your strategies for driving career development and transition?
So within our own organisation, we are actually looking at our own people strategy to have a look at the how we support our staff to grow and change their skills. And I think it's important to recognise that we do think it's a grow. It's very much, as they've been doing, many of them for 20 years plus, they've been adapting and changing to technology as it arrives in the workplace now, and they're really confident about it. So we certainly see our workforce strategy as continuing that process of supporting their process, supporting our staff to change. Probably the emphasis that we have is more on agility, on more virtual workforces, less structure. And I think that sort of went well with our previous speaker, that broader concept about, going where your skills take you, going where the organisation needs you, is very much the focus that we're focusing on. But also, as with organisations, we are trying to take the dull, boring work out of it and actually allow people to find the really interesting work to do.
Fantastic. Do we have any other questions, or any questions, I should say, from the floor? Yes, this lady just over here.
Hello, Amy Crawford from the Department of Communications and the Arts. I have an interest from the public sector point of view in handling the new move to the gig economy in the younger workforce, looking for that flexibility, looking for how they can build that into their career, and how that works with the perhaps more view of the longer term public servant 20 plus years as we're changing into the future. Thank you.
Who would like to answer that?
I'd actually like to comment on that. I think there is an opportunity for the public sector's talent model to change and to become much more flexible. I come out of a long career in management consulting where our talent model was very much, which part of the organisation do you fit into, where can you grow, what kind of roles can see you move through, or some of the more brutal employers I had was you're up or you're out. But I can definitely see an opportunity for the public sector to take on some of those aspects of more of a consulting talent model than they have today, where you move through the organisation not via department but via skill. Interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the employment model and the way in which the public service has worked up until this point will necessarily need to change going forward, and we are seeing some of that happen. Particularly, some agencies are much more advanced than others when it comes to their flexible approach to that. We do not see a lot of mobility across the service, so we only had something like 2% of public servants actually change departments last year. So changing that mindset around people being much more open to moving across departments, I think, is something that is a challenge for us, and we're continuing to have conversations around that. And hopefully, as part of the talent work, as we think about what other skills people need and we actually start to move people, that will produce a bit more openness to how we can actually transition across.
I might just throw my 2 cents as well. So certainly the concept of gig in terms of doing pieces of work as opposed to being in a permanent structure. I think we do that now in a sense in that we do use contractors for particular pieces of work. I know that I've got quite a large IT shop within my organisation, and I've got a reasonable percentage of contractors who come in and out depending on the level of work that I do and the type of work that we've got on. But I'd also want to comment on the mobility. So that's an area where we're quite concerned about as a department. So we've instituted a process where we're engaged with a number of departments and swapped, at this point at the SES level, for a year at a time, a number of key roles. That's been a fantastic exercise for us. It's worked really well. We're brought in new ideas and new skills. I'm about to lose one of my band ones who swapped in, and the entire team learnt so much from him. But he learnt from us as well, and I think that's a really powerful thing, and we don't do enough of it.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Brad?
Somewhat related to that, earlier we heard somebody discussing the idea that a person might have 11 different jobs across their career now. How can that be facilitated in public sector? It's notoriously difficult for somebody at a senior level in public sector to go out and then come back in again. So are there mechanisms by which we can make it easy for people to have a more flexible career that may or may not involve certain segments inside and outside the public sector?
Look, certainly that is something that we have been looking at. There are a lot of public servants that may have been in the public service for 30 years but have had easily 11 different careers in that time. So I think it's that's one of the wonderful things about the service, is that you can do a range of different roles. We do have numbers of people that go out and come back in, and people do that based upon their desire to do something different or to live in a different location. So we are really considering how we try and make that a broader conversation so that people know that when they come in there is the opportunity to go out and do different things. As Martin said, that example is amazing, and it's one example that's going on in the service at the moment where there are fantastic opportunities for people to go out and bring different skills back. We also are very open to bringing in lateral hires, people coming in at senior levels to bring different skills and experience. And we need to be an attractive employer for that to occur.
Just over here.
Hi, Darren Harvey, CTO Group. I was just wondering if you see knowledge erosion as the older workforce leave the public sector as an issue, and if so, how you combat that?
We're not going to let anyone retire.
Yeah, so look, from our perspective, so like many organisations in the public sector, I've had a number of my senior staff, my Band 2s, leave relatively recently. They're hitting that 54-11 benchmark for a lot of them. And that's certainly been a really interesting transition for us, making sure that they have transferred their knowledge, and as good managers they should, to their staff is important. But also making sure that them leaving has actually enabled us to make sure that we're getting new ideas and new knowledge in. So I don't think it's always a deficit. We have to guard against key knowledge going, but you know, that I think can be guarded against. And with good staff, we know that it's, you know, we've moved away from that I'm holding central to me all the knowledge and the power of my position. I think we've got past that. That position of your staff, your team needs to know what you know, I think is certainly embedded in our culture. And the opportunity for new people coming in, bringing different ideas and using that knowledge in a different way, I think is really, really powerful. So we see a net positive.
Did anybody else have a comment on that? Any more questions from the floor? This gentleman just here.
Chris Johnson from the Australian Council of Deans of ICT. We've heard a bit about the difficulties of people getting into the workforce from their first degrees, that missing second step. And it used to be that the public service was one of the employers of choice to train up people who would then go out and hit the world with that first couple of years' experience under their belt. Can you say anything about where you see the role of the public service in this in the future, or the roles in which you might expect other parts of industry to pick up on this need to get people who can't necessarily pay for their own internships or can't afford to do free internships to somehow get that second step?
Martin.
Yeah, so we agree that's a really interesting issue. And part of that is, from our perspective, thinking about how we work with business, both small, medium and large, to think about how they invest in their workforce is certainly a piece of work that we're very interested in. What we saw, probably a slightly different context rather than young people coming through, but a similar sort of issue was when we were looking at the transitioning of workers from the factories, we ended up with a co-investment model where Ford and Holden and I think Toyota, the state governments and the Australian government pooled funds for training to actually support those workers to transition to a different role. And that's been a pretty effective sort of model, but actually getting the idea that you might be investing in staff to move to a different organisation is a challenge for a lot of Australian business. Other cultures seem to be more willing to do it. Certainly the Germans seem to have a much stronger investment in staff. But that concept that, hang on, if I train this person up, they might be going, does seem to be an inhibitor. But it's certainly, I think, a really interesting challenge. So when we sort of talk to industry or business about it, we sort of say, well, I think the bigger issue is if you don't train them up and they stay. And I think we need more of that culture or discussion. But I do think industry and the broader Australian business community does need to engage in that whole process of bringing people in, young, old, middle career, and think about how they skill them for their future.
It does seem to be a bit of a theme from today, the need to connect industries and support that career development across industry sectors. Kerryn, did you have a particular view on that?
Look, I think the public service does still run a very, very big grad program, and we spend a lot of time going out to universities trying to encourage grads to come in. We also run programs for people prior to actually becoming grads, so essentially to assist them through the last couple of years of their degrees, and in some cases, in some cohorts, including into the year 12. So I think that the service is working really hard to try and ensure that we are offering that base. And certainly we are overwhelmed every year with our grad programs, and we're out there at the moment. So if you know anyone that's graduating, let them know that we're out looking. But, you know, we know the areas we also need to really target, and it was interesting hearing the data scientist comment, because we know that that's an area we really need to target in the public service. So.
And I think, to your point too, I think when you read research that says there's no lack of willingness to change on the part of employees, that willingness is somewhat for naught unless the employer is willing to invest in helping people acquire the right skills to be productive and effective in this new world of work. So the two things, you know, the willingness has to be matched by the investment on the part of the employer to make sure that the skills are learned and are applied.
Absolutely. Yes, just this lady over here.
Yes, hello. My name is Gillian McPhee from the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals. We heard this morning from Dr. Andrew Charlton the need for growth in particularly health, human services and education, and how the fear factor is actually stifling the growth of new business models. I'm wondering whether the panel would have any comment to make about the concept of a public service mutual, which has been used to great effect in the UK over the last decade, where public servants are actually given the right to spin out of government and actually form employee-owned mutuals. Now, these are new structures where there are asset locks and mission locks on those organisations, and they are a new way of developing and delivering public service in areas where we do have a need, particularly in health and human services. We have just had Australia's first employee mutual announced with bipartisan support in the South Australian government that will operate in the NDIS. So it is an emerging business model that I'm talking about, which the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals is supporting and advocating. So I'd be interested in your views on that, please.
Panellists, who would like to address that question?
I can have a go, partly because with 20 years of outsourced service provision in our employment networks, we probably have some analogies more than a direct correlation. Though I do also remember a time when some of the IT and other services were spun out of public service. I think there's a couple of quite large IT-based organisations who were formed by former public servants. I'm not quite sure they're mutuals, but certainly I think they've been about. So what we see within our employment service network is actually quite a strong spine of former government employees, often at senior management level now. So they were CES in 20 odd years ago. They've now working still in the same service provision that they did for many, many years, but they're now working in not-for-profit. In 50% of the service delivery is not-for-profit, and often they're former public servants, and also for-profit organisations. So certainly as a model, do I think it could work? Yes, I do. There's no doubt that public servants have the skills to deliver the services, predominantly because in many cases, and I used to run service delivery in the ACT government, public servants have been delivering that for a long time. The NDIS example would make perfect sense to me. Having been a provider of disability services, those staff are perfectly capable of running their own businesses, working together and delivering services.
I think we had a question over here before from this gentleman. No. Can we get a microphone over here? Thank you.
Hello, Lawrence Icosa, actually from Tulsa as well. I've got 3 kids. I'm just wondering, I feel a bit disjointed from my kids sometimes because I don't actually know what they're learning. So I was curious to find out with the graduates that are coming into the public service, how do you find them? Do you find them, do you find them with sufficient levels of skills and analytics to help with the public service, or I'm curious to know the morphing of education from the past to the present, just.
Yeah. Caroline, were you about to say something then?
No.
Sorry,
wasn't it?
Kerryn then.
Look, we find the grads coming in are all pretty amazing. So they are ready. In lots of ways, they're ready to work. The kids that are coming through today and the older grads that are coming through today are coming to the public service because they really want to make a difference. So we find that the people, both culturally, are a good fit, but they also are coming with a lot of really strong skills. And then we spend that 12 months, like we often tell grads that 12 months is your time to suck up every bit of knowledge you can, to make any mistake that that you're going to make, you make in your grad year, because people will help you get through some of that stuff, and that's how you will learn. But yeah, they're fit for great work, and we've had some great experiences with grads. The hard thing sometimes in the public service is keeping them. So after 4 or 5 years, they are primed and ready to go out and do other things. So sometimes we sort of feel a bit of that loss, but then we let them go, hoping they'll come back at some point too. So they're ready to go.
Any other questions from the floor? Sorry, this gentleman just here.
Hi, my name's Harry from DHS. Kerryn, this is probably more of a question for you. In terms of job design, the current approach to... Sorry, I scribbled on a napkin my question. We delegate work based on classification. As we move towards a more agile approach to work, where tasks are delegated based on an individual's skills, knowledge or capabilities. Given the constraints of designing jobs under the APSC job families model and the job statements, generic job statements, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how we move forward with designing jobs in this space, in the APS in particular.
Yes, certainly. Look, job families and job design is something that we set the benchmarks around so people have an idea of where to start. But we are seeing structures flattening and we're seeing task teams standing up, and that is changing some of the ways in which people are working. So we will always say that job families and the design structures that are out there are set as a guide, acknowledging that that stuff will need to change as we go forward, and we're doing quite a lot of work with agencies around that, because we are seeing more and more sort of agile work groups popping up, doing work cross-departmental, within departments, and that necessarily changes the way in which we define that. So it's much more activity-based design.
Probably got time for one more question from the floor. This lady over here.
Thank you. Cecilia Ridgely from ACT Government. My question goes to machinery of government changes and reconciling top-down change from machinery of government with the gig economy and bottom-up development of expertise. I'm just wondering what the panellists' thoughts on that might be.
Who'd like to have a crack?
Yeah, look, why don't I have a start at it anyway? It's quite a complex question. So, look, and I've been through a few mould changes in my years. I think all the public servants in the room will have. And they are always an interesting challenge from a number of aspects. So probably the piece that we work on right from the start is culture. So the reality that we find is, public servants come with a great set of skills, and we very rarely have to work on the skills. It's more about how we develop an effective organisation. So how do we actually bring in a team, learn from that team, adopt the positives from that team, but also make sure that they're adopting our positives as well, is the work that we spend a lot of time focusing on. So that, I'm not sure whether that's top-down or bottom-up, because it's both. I mean, it's really important to learn from the culture of the organisation coming in or together. And that culture is held at all sorts of levels within the organisation. It absolutely has to be held at the top levels, but it's also got to be held right through the organisation. So we spend a lot of time working on that particular piece. Generally, we don't change their role a large amount. That's the sort of that's what happens with a mould. We don't change what they do. We bring them together into a different organisation and try to get efficiencies or effectiveness through that, or a different way of thinking. In terms of the gig, we probably don't think about the staff coming in that context, or using change staff in that context either. It's more, we probably do try and find opportunities for them to participate in other parts of the organisation, and for parts of the existing organisation to participate in them, so we can actually do that interchange of culture and ideas as effectively as possible. So I'm not sure whether that's what you're driving at, but we try and get that mix and that blend happening quite early. It helps with the culture piece, but also helps learning about the new part of the organisation, and for that organisation, that part of the organisation, to learn about what was there already, if that makes sense.
I think it's encouraging to hear that there are many issues faced by the Australian Public Service as we're facing in the private sector. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panellists for today's session. Thank you.